So, Islamic fundamentalism is kind of this approach to institutionalizing reform with a crusader mentality. And not just making changes, but imposing those changes elsewhere. Now, fundamentalism is a term that is used in a variety of situations. Predominantly, we hear about maybe Christian fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism, but people have also spoken of Jewish fundamentalism, very, very small group, but in Israel there is a rather militant, separatist group of Jews that want to change some of the politics of Israel. And we can even talk about Hindu fundamentalism in contemporary life. Fundamentalism as a term started out as a 20th century American Protestant movement within Christianity, responding to a lot of those things that we saw with the development of the Pittsburgh Platform. Right? And so the Pittsburgh Platform, the acceptance of higher criticism, the acceptance of modern science. Well, fundamentalists in Christianity rejected that, responded to that, and developed fundamentalism. But now, fundamentalism is a term that applies in other religions. And what it demonstrates is that there is this significant connection among these types of groups across different religions. Fundamentalists often perceive threats to their way of life from the larger culture around them. And so they develop primarily as resistance movements. Modern life, modern culture is dangerous. It has the potential to damage deeply held religious truths. And so fundamentalist groups believe that this danger must be resisted rigorously. Sometimes that resistance is simply by, promulgating an ideology, writing or speaking. And in some cases, it's lobbying for political changes. Sometimes it's through violence. Fundamentalists also tend to look back to a traditional religious culture, right? A time that there was once the control that they wanted to see. Right? At one point, this nation, this country, followed the ways of Christianity, Islam, etc. And so for Islamic fundamentalists, this is looking back to that orthodox or rightly guided caliphate. This group of leaders right after the death of Muhammad. Now, often these traditional religious cultures are imagined past. They didn't exist as they think of. And a lot of the people, the leaders, wouldn't necessarily have adopted many of the things that fundamentalists have done. But with this belief that once in the past things were done the right way, but now they're gone. And so by this divergence between contemporary society and this imagined past, there's this feeling that among fundamentalists that they should be the heirs to the founders. That they should be the ones in control of political powers, in control of the country. And so usually there's this resentment, frustration, sometimes anger, sometimes even militancy. Fundamentalists also tend to look to inerrant, unquestioned sources of authority, whether that's religious texts or whether that's specific leaders. And any questioning of that authority is perceived as kind of a slippery slope to chaos. And so there's no room for questioning. Well, is that really what the Quran says? Is that really what Sharia is talking about? Or in the case of Christian fundamentalism, is that really how we should interpret that passage in the Bible? Fundamentalists also tend to have a very dualistic worldview. You're either in or you're out. You're either for us or against us. The world essentially is a battleground between two opposing forces. But just like we talked about with revival movements in Islam, the fundamentalist groups in Islam and elsewhere tend to reject modern culture but accept modern technology. They're the ones that are first out there as new technologies develop. They're for Christian fundamentalists on on the radio, and then the TV, and then on the internet. And of course for Islamic fundamentalists using the internet and other expressions, kind of denounce modern culture, but using modern culture to promote their message. So within these characteristics that we see in different types of fundamentalism, we can see now, we can talk about Islamic fundamentalism. Essentially, this kind of institutionalization of reform with this idea of going out and crusading for it, both against the West as well as against Muslim governments. Any government in the eyes of fundamentalists who don't follow Sharia law, that don't want to uphold Sharia, are illegitimate governments. They must be opposed, they must be overthrown. They are not religious, they are atheists. And that the circle of scholars, of Islamic scholars, have been corrupted by these atheist governments as well, and so they can't be listened to either. Ultimately, fundamentalists as well will take jihad of the sword as a religious duty. Right? It's not just it can happen. Fundamentalists believe, or Islamists believe, it must happen. Right? You must be involved in this. So where does fundamentalism come from? Well, you think back to some of those things that we talked about, this colonialism, this humiliation, occupation by Western countries, fostered this anger, fostered this resistance. So there's this distrust of the West and what the West has done. Distrust of governments that have supported the West. Connected with this is the Wahhabi government of Saudi Arabia. Strongly traditionalists, having a very literalist, puritanical, exclusivistic, intolerant approach to Scripture, to Sharia. Now, of course, in the midst of this all is oil. And the power of oil in all of this cannot be underestimated and shouldn't be ignored. So the oil-rich nations, including Saudi Arabia, banded together in the 20th century to form OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And the goal behind OPEC was to control the price of oil through distribution and control availability and price and all those kind of things. But in order to gain any sort of power and wealth from oil, you have to have people to buy oil. And of course, that meant encountering and interacting with the West. And as people interacted with the West, many people in some of these countries began to question the traditional ways and, should we really be opposed to some of these beliefs and practices? But there were some Saudis who rested on the beliefs of Wahhabism, that traditional and that opposition to anything non-Islamic, including the shy but privileged son of a powerful Saudi family named Osama bin Laden. Very ultra-conservative Wahhabism conjoined with this militant ideology that shaped the young bin Laden. And then with the Islamic revivals and renewals in the 60s and the 70s, and then the success in Iran, kind of really fostered within bin Laden this desire to see this broad Muslim revival. One of the first places that he started with this goal was supporting financially, and then later going to Afghanistan, the Afghani rebels were resisting the Soviet Union at the time. So between 1979 and 1982, the Soviets were trying to occupy Afghanistan, and so here's bin Laden out there helping these Muslims trying to resist this. The rebels were also helped by the United States government. And basically the irony in all of this, all right? Helping these governments that will later turn against us. When the Saudi king allowed American troops to station themselves during Gulf War I in the 90s, that was the last straw for bin Laden. That was kind of the last of this westernization. And so he becomes even more zealous, eventually kind of becoming the most prominent vocal mouthpiece of these revolutionary jihadist or Islamist groups. One of the other pieces within all of this is this belief that these ideologies they have about Sharia and the Quran are the prime interpretation. These are the right interpretations. They are unchangeable. Right? So they have these kind of views from these centuries ago that cannot change with modern life. And so that's it. Right? And so any sort of modern innovation is looked upon in the same way as any sort of heresy. Right? And so, it would obviously be heretical to claim that Muhammad, as a Muslim, to claim that Muhammad was not a prophet. But any sort of modernization that you want to do for fundamentalists is also seen as heresy. And so innovators are looked upon as poisoning Muslim society. Questions about fundamentalism in Islam. In many respects, it's, again, one of those things that could be understood in a different context. I mean, obviously, the violence that comes really throws a lot of this off. But I found this interesting little section in a book that helps, again, it doesn't justify the violence. It does not justify any of the hatred, but helps us understand it. Few of us ask, writes a man named Paul Kennedy, how do we appear to them? And what would it be like were our places in the world reversed? Suppose that there existed today a powerful, unified Arab-Muslim state that stretched from Algeria to Turkey and Arabia, as there was 400 years ago, the Ottoman Empire. Suppose this unified Arab-Muslim state had the biggest economy in the world and the most effective military. Contrast this, by contrast, suppose the United States of ours had been split into 12 or 15 countries with different regimes, some conservative and corrupt. Suppose that the great Arab Muslim power had its aircraft carriers cruising off our shores, its aircraft flying over our lands, its satellites watching us every day. Suppose that its multinational corporations had reached into North America to extract oil and paid the corrupt, conservative governments big royalties for that. Suppose that it dominated all international institutions like the Security Council and the IMF. Suppose that there was a special state set up in North America 50 years ago of a different religion and language to ours, and the giant Arab Muslim power always gave it support. Suppose the Colossus state was bombarding us with cultural messages about the status of women, about sexuality, that we found offensive. Suppose it was always urging us to change, to modernize, to go global, to follow its example. In those conditions, would not many Americans steadily grow to loathe that Colossus, wish it harm, and perhaps try to harm it? Again, it doesn't justify the violence, but by putting ourselves in their shoes, we can perhaps understand why it takes place. Obviously, there is no easy solution to it. But again, a lot of that has been shaped by historical forces.